The morning light barely penetrated the heavy curtains of Sarah Mitchell's bedroom as she stared at the ceiling, watching shadows shift across the plaster. Her alarm hadn't even gone off yet. She'd been awake since 4:15 a.m., her mind a relentless carousel of anxiety that wouldn't stop spinning. Today was November 14th. Today was the day that would determine whether she kept her children or lost them forever. Today was the culmination of 18 months of legal battles, character assassinations, and a carefully orchestrated campaign by her ex-husband to paint her as an unfit mother. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow, and no amount of positive self-talk seemed capable of quelling the panic that threatened to consume her entirely. Beside the bed, Bella lay sleeping on her orthopedic dog bed, her golden coat gleaming even in the dim light. The 6-year-old retriever was more than just a pet. She was Sarah's bridge between the world and her own fractured mind. Bella had been professionally trained for 18 months at an intensive service animal facility that specialized in deep pressure therapy and anxiety response. The dog had cost Sarah nearly $15,000, money she'd saved by working late nights, skipping vacations, and making countless sacrifices. But every penny had been worth it because Bella represented something more important than money. She represented Sarah's commitment to being better, to managing her illness, to being the mother her children deserved. Sarah pushed herself out of bed at 5:47 a.m. and walked to the bathroom on unsteady legs. She caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The circles under her eyes were pronounced, dark purple crescents that suggested countless sleepless nights. Her hair, usually thick and lustrous, seemed limp despite her efforts. Her face had taken on a drawn quality, worry etched into every line. She looked fragile, vulnerable, exactly the opposite of what she needed to appear in court today. But Sarah had learned long ago that appearance was only one layer of truth, and the truth of her situation was far more complicated than what any judge might see on first glance. She reached for her medication bottles on the shelf above the sink. First, the anxiety medication, one tablet same as every morning for the past 3 years. Then the antidepressant, one tablet without fail. Then the vitamin supplement her therapist had recommended. She filled a glass with water and swallowed each pill methodically, deliberately, with the kind of ritualistic care that had become her anchor to stability. 3 years of perfect compliance. 3 years of never missing a single dose, even on days when her depression made the act of lifting her arm feel insurmountable. This consistency was her armor, her evidence of responsibility. Her quiet rebellion against the narrative was building against her. By 6:30 a.m., Sarah had showered, dried her hair, and begun the careful process of selecting her courtroom outfit. She pulled clothes from her closet with deliberate intention. Not too formal. Judges could sense arrogance in overly expensive clothing. Not too casual. The court system responded to those who showed respect for its processes. She settled on a navy blazer that fit perfectly, a cream silk blouse that conveyed professionalism without coldness, and tailored trousers that made her look pulled together but still approachable. She slipped on her mother's pearl earrings, the ones her mother had worn to her own wedding decades ago, and took a moment to absorb the weight of family history and maternal courage they represented. At 7:15 a.m., her children emerged from their bedrooms, still drowsy but ready for the day. Emma, 8 years old, had her mother's dark hair and her father's serious expression. She was the contemplative child, the one who noticed everything and asked questions that cut to the heart of matters. Only 6, still possessed that childhood innocence that hadn't yet been fully corrupted by the realities of family dissolution. He bounded into the kitchen with his characteristic enthusiasm, asking what was for breakfast. "Cereal today, buddy. Your favorite," Sarah said, keeping her voice light despite the turmoil churning beneath her skin. She poured milk, added frosted flakes to bowls, and sat across from her children, trying to memorize every detail of this moment. The way Emma's nose crinkled when she concentrated. The way swung his feet under the table because they didn't quite touch the floor yet. the sound of their quiet contentment as they ate. These were the details she'd need to hold on to, the anchors to her purpose if today went terribly wrong. Emma looked up from her cereal with those penetrating eyes that seemed far too old for her 8 years. "Mommy, is today the day, the important day?" Sarah's heart stuttered. She tried to shield her children from the legal proceedings, had attempted to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a situation that was fundamentally fractured. But children were perceptive creatures, especially children whose parents were falling apart around them. "Yes, sweetheart, today is an important day," Sarah admitted, choosing honesty over the comfort of lies. "I have to go talk to a judge about some grown-up things. You're going to spend the day with Grandma and we'll have a special dinner tonight, all 3 of us." "Will Daddy be there?" asked innocently, his small voice carrying the weight of a child's desperate hope that his parents might somehow reconcile. "No, buddy. Your father will be there, but we won't be together. It's just grown-up business," Sarah said gently, her heart breaking at the confusion in his expression. "But I want you both to know something very important. No matter what happens today, no matter what any judge says, I love you both more than I love breathing. You are the most important things in my entire world. Every decision I make, every hard thing I do is because I want to be the best mother I can be for you." After breakfast, Sarah drove her children to her mother's house, a small bungalow in a quiet neighborhood where she'd grown up. Her mother answered the door with the kind of knowing sadness that only a parent could muster. She'd lived through her own marriage dissolution, her own custody battles decades earlier, and recognized the particular terror in her daughter's eyes. "You're going to be okay," said, pulling Sarah into a fierce embrace. "You're stronger than you know." The drive from her mother's house to the courthouse took 30 minutes. 30 minutes during which Sarah sat in traffic, hands gripping the steering wheel, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the day she'd first been diagnosed with anxiety disorder and PTSD. She thought about initial patience gradually eroding into contempt. She thought about his lawyer's relentless campaign to position her mental health as evidence of unfitness. And beside her in the passenger seat, Bella rested her head against the window, a calm presence that seemed to absorb all of Sarah's terror and replace it with quiet strength. The courtroom was colder than Sarah had imagined, all polished wood and institutional beige, with high ceilings that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small. She sat at the defendant's table with her lawyer, Robert, a competent but unremarkable attorney who'd cost her most of her savings. Across the aisle sat Mitchell with his legal team, 2 attorneys from a prestigious downtown firm that specialized in family law. They looked sharp, confident, dangerous. Wore an expensive charcoal suit and an expression of carefully calibrated concern, the mask of a wronged man forced into an impossible situation. Judge Harrison entered at precisely 9 a.m., and everyone rose respectfully. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of worldly expression that suggested he'd seen every manipulation tactic imaginable. He settled into his chair and began reading through the case file, his face revealing nothing. The courtroom felt suffocating, like the air had been drained away, leaving only tension. After the initial procedural formalities, Saturni, a sharp woman named Victoria, called to the witness stand. He walked with measured steps, his expression a masterpiece of reluctant dignity, a man carrying an unbearable burden but determined to do the right thing for his children. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, his voice steady and sincere. Victoria began her questioning with softballs designed to establish credibility. Where did he work? How long had they been married? How many children did they have together? Answered each question with the precision of a man who'd been coached extensively. He was a mid-level manager at a consulting firm. They'd been married for 11 years, and they had 2 beautiful children whom he loved more than life itself. His voice cracked slightly when he mentioned the children, a perfect touch of genuine emotion that made him seem relatable and devoted. "Mr. Mitchell," Victoria continued, Can you describe for the court your concerns regarding your wife's mental health and its impact on your children?" This was the moment. Took a breath, and Sarah watched as he transformed before her eyes. His expression shifted into one of profound sadness mixed with resignation, the look of a man who tried everything and finally accepted a difficult truth. "It's been very hard," he began, his voice carrying the weight of suffering. "Sarah is a wonderful woman, and I still care about her deeply. But over the past few years, her mental health has deteriorated significantly. She's been diagnosed with anxiety disorder and something called PTSD, and while I've tried to be supportive, the reality is that her condition has become increasingly difficult to manage." Sarah's hands clenched beneath the table. Everything he was saying was technically true, but the way he was framing it, the implications embedded in his careful word choices, was devastatingly false. Continued, "There have been numerous incidents where her anxiety has manifested in ways that have frightened the children. There was one morning when she couldn't get out of bed. Emma came to me crying because her mother wouldn't respond to her, asked me if mommy was broken. Those are his exact words. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that his mother is too overwhelmed by anxiety to function?" The courtroom was silent. Sarah could feel the judge's attention sharpening, his pen moving across his notepad. She wanted to scream that was twisting the truth, that one incident had occurred years ago, before her medication had been properly adjusted, before her therapy had begun to show real progress. But she sat frozen, watching her ex-husband perform his masterpiece. "There was another incident," said, his voice dropping lower as if sharing a confidence with the judge, "where Sarah missed Emma's school play. Emma had been looking forward to it for weeks. She was in the choir, had rehearsed constantly, and Sarah promised she'd be there. But the night before, Sarah had an anxiety attack so severe that she couldn't leave the house. She called me in tears, saying she just couldn't do it. Emma has never been the same about performing since then. She's withdrawn, less confident. That moment cost our daughter something precious." Again, technically there was truth buried in this narrative. Sarah had missed one school event 3 years ago due to a severe panic attack, but failed to mention that she'd attended every single event since then, that Emma had actually become quite confident again, that her teacher had even mentioned her growing participation. Wasn't lying exactly. He was just painting with a very specific palette of partial truths. "I've tried to support her," went on, his eyes glistening now with what looked like unshed tears. "I've encouraged her to go to therapy, to take her medication, to seek help, and I'm grateful she's done those things. But the reality is, managing her condition has fallen largely on my shoulders. I've had to be both mother and father. I've had to be the stable presence while she battles her internal demons. It's exhausting, and I love my children too much to watch them be confused and frightened by their mother's episodes." He paused, letting that sink in. Sarah could see the narrative taking shape in the judge's mind, a man sacrificing himself, putting his children's needs above his own emotions, trying to protect them from an unstable parent. "I'm not saying Sarah is a bad person," said, his voice now carrying a tone of magnanimous forgiveness. "But I am saying that the children need consistency and stability. They need a parent who can be fully present, fully functional, fully capable of meeting their needs every single day. And right now, I'm not confident that Sarah can provide that." Victoria asked a few follow-up questions, all designed to reinforce his narrative of sacrifice and concern. She asked about specific incidents, about his attempts to help, about his fears for the children's emotional. Answered each question like a man who'd rehearsed them dozens of times, his performance flawless and compelling. Then came the cross-examination. Robert stood up and Sarah felt a flutter of hope. Surely he would dismantle this narrative, would expose the distortions and half-truths. But Robert's questioning was hesitant, almost apologetic. He asked to clarify the timeline of the school play incident. When exactly had it occurred? Answered smoothly, 3 years ago, right after Sarah's initial diagnosis, before her treatment had been optimized. Robert asked about other incidents, but his questions lacked teeth. They felt perfunctory, as if he was going through motions he didn't fully believe in. Left the witness stand looking exactly like a hero, a man who'd been forced to speak difficult truths, who tried to protect his children while maintaining compassion for his ex-wife's struggles, who'd sacrificed his own peace of mind for his family's. The courtroom seemed to collectively exhale, and Sarah could see the judge's expression had shifted. There was doubt there now, concern, a subtle leaning towards version of events. As past the defendant's table on his way back to his seat, he caught Sarah's eye for just a moment. In that microsecond, his expression flickered and she saw it. She saw the satisfaction there, the triumph barely concealed beneath his mask of concern. He performed perfectly and they both knew it. He'd taken her deepest struggles, her honest battles with mental illness, and weaponized them into evidence of her unfitness. And worst of all, the judge seemed to be believing every word. Sarah's heart sank deeper into her chest as she realized the mountain she would have to climb. The afternoon sun streamed through the courtroom windows as Robert stood and announced, "The defense calls Sarah Mitchell to the stand." Sarah's stomach twisted into a knot so tight she thought she might be sick. This was it. This was her moment to fight back, to reclaim her narrative, to show the judge that she wasn't the broken woman had portrayed. She rose on trembling legs, Bella pressing against her thigh as if to offer strength through proximity. The judge had already ruled that Bella could remain at Sarah's feet during testimony, given her certification as a service animal. At least she would have that anchor. Sarah walked to the witness stand, her navy blazer suddenly feeling like armor that was far too thin. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the chair that faced the entire courtroom. From this position she could see across the room, his expression carefully neutral. She could see his attorneys, Victoria particularly, poised like a predator preparing to strike. She could see the judge, his expression unreadable but somehow already disappointed. And she could see the gallery, courtroom observers, some she recognized as people had likely invited to witness his vindication. Robert began with gentle questions, establishing the basics. When had she been diagnosed with anxiety disorder? What was her current treatment regimen? Had she maintained consistency with her therapy and medication? Sarah answered each question carefully, speaking about her 3-year journey toward stability. She described how she'd initially resisted seeking help, how she'd eventually recognized that her condition was affecting her family, how she'd made the difficult decision to pursue professional treatment. "Can you describe your current mental health status?" Robert asked, his voice supportive and warm. I'm in a much better place," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been consistently taking my medication for 3 years without missing a single dose. I see my therapist every week, and we've worked together to develop coping strategies. I've also invested in professional training for Bella, my service dog, because I wanted to be proactive about managing my anxiety." Robert nodded, encouraging her to elaborate. "Tell us about your work life." "I'm a freelance accountant," Sarah explained. "I chose that career specifically because it allows me flexibility with the children's schedules. I work from home most days, which means I'm present when they come home from school. I'm available for appointments, school events, emergencies. Over the past 2 years, I've maintained a roster of steady clients, and my income has been consistent." Everything she was saying was true, and she felt herself beginning to relax slightly. Maybe this would work. Maybe the truth would be enough. Robert asked about her involvement in her children's lives, and Sarah described attending Emma's soccer games, helping with his reading, being present for homework and bedtime routines. She talked about taking them to the park, baking cookies together, maintaining traditions. Her voice grew warmer as she spoke about her children, and she allowed herself to believe that the judge was hearing her, really hearing her. Then Robert finished his questions and said, "Your witness," directing his statement toward Victoria. The moment shifted like a predator sensing vulnerability. Victoria stood, and Sarah could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. The opposing counsel walked slowly around the courtroom, her heels clicking against the floor in a deliberate rhythm designed to unsettle. "Ms. Mitchell," Victoria began, her tone dripping with artificial sympathy, "you mentioned you've been consistently taking your medication. That's impressive. But tell me, have you ever forgotten a dose? Have you ever skipped medication because you didn't want to take it?" Sarah hesitated. "No, I've never intentionally skipped a dose." "Never?" Victoria's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Not even once?" "No," Sarah said firmly, but her voice wavered slightly. "I understand how important it is to my and to my family's. And yet, you still experience anxiety attacks, correct? You still have moments where you're overwhelmed by panic." Yes, but they're much less frequent than they used to be, and I have strategies to manage them," Sarah explained, but she could hear her voice becoming less certain. Victoria circled back to the school play incident. "You missed your daughter's school performance 3 years ago, is that correct?" "Yes, but that was before my treatment was fully optimized. I had a severe panic attack that night and I couldn't." "I didn't ask for an explanation," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "I simply asked if you missed the event. The answer is yes, isn't it?" "Yes," Sarah acknowledged, and she could feel the courtroom's energy shifting against her. Victoria pressed on, her questions becoming sharper, more accusatory. She asked about times Sarah had felt overwhelmed, times she'd needed support, times she'd struggled to function. Each question was framed in a way that forced Sarah to either admit to weakness or appear dishonest. She was being backed into a corner, and she could feel it happening in real time. "Ms. Mitchell, you mentioned anxiety attacks. How many of these attacks occur in the presence of your children?" Sarah's hands began to tremble. I've had maybe 2 or 3 since they were very young, but that was years ago, and since my treatment." 2 or 3 anxiety attacks in front of your children," Victoria repeated, as if this was damning evidence. "And these episodes, they're frightening for the children, aren't they? You lose control. You can't comfort them. You're essentially unavailable during these moments." "That's not fair," Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "I've worked very hard to manage my condition. The attacks have decreased dramatically, and when I do feel anxious, I have coping mechanisms." "But you still experience them," Victoria pressed relentlessly. "Despite being on medication, despite therapy, despite having a service dog, you still have moments where your mental health compromises your parenting." Sarah felt tears beginning to form, and she desperately tried to blink them away. This was exactly what she'd wanted to avoid. This emotional display, this visible breaking apart, it was exactly what narrative had promised the judge. She could see it in the judge's expression, the subtle hardening, the shift from neutrality to skepticism. "I'm doing everything I can," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I've never put my children in danger. I've never left them alone. I've sought professional help, invested in my own." "Ms. Mitchell," Victoria interrupted, her tone now almost gentle, which was somehow worse than the aggression. "Are you currently experiencing anxiety? Right now in this courtroom?" Sarah's hands were shaking visibly. Her breath came in shorter gasps. She looked down at Bella, who immediately raised her head, sensing her owner's distress. She could feel Bella's presence, could feel the dog beginning her trained response to Sarah's escalating anxiety. "Yes," Sarah admitted, her voice small. "I'm nervous about these proceedings. It's natural to be nervous." "Of course," Victoria said sympathetically. "And this is a controlled environment with people who are trying to help. Imagine how difficult it must be for your children, who love you and fear losing you, watching you struggle with these emotional episodes." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but she felt tears streaming down her face now. Her carefully constructed composure was crumbling. She looked at the judge, hopping for some sign of understanding, but his expression was unreadable, and that might have been worse than outright judgment. "No further questions," Victoria said. returning to her seat with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully dismantled their opponent's credibility. Sarah stepped down from the witness stand feeling utterly destroyed. As she returned to the defendant's table, Bella pressed against her legs, offering what comfort a dog could provide. But Sarah knew the damage had been done. She'd walked into that courtroom hoping to convince the judge that she was a capable, responsible mother. Instead, she'd given him exactly what narrative had promised, a visibly struggling woman who couldn't even hold herself together under mild pressure. How could such a woman possibly be trusted with children? The judge's expression had shifted entirely. Where there had been initial skepticism, now there was something that looked dangerously close to disapproval. Victoria wasn't finished. After Sarah returned to the defendant's table, Robert had a brief redirect, but it felt perfunctory, almost apologetic. He asked Sarah a few softball questions designed to rehabilitate her image, but the damage was already catastrophic. Sarah answered mechanically, her voice hollow, her eyes distant. She felt as though she was watching herself from outside her body, observing a woman drowning in slow motion, while the courtroom remained perfectly still. Then Victoria stood again. She'd saved something for her second round, a weapon she'd been holding in reserve. "Ms. Mitchell, I want to go back to something. You mentioned that you've invested in professional training for your dog. That's quite an expense, isn't it? Nearly $15,000. Sarah nodded, unsure where this was going. "Yes, I saved for it because I wanted to be proactive about managing my condition." "But if you're managing your condition so well with medication and therapy, why did you feel the need to spend $15,000 on a service dog?" Victoria's tone was almost curious, as if she genuinely wondered about Sarah's logic. "Doesn't the mere fact that you needed additional support suggest that your current treatment plan is insufficient?" The question was brilliant in its cruelty. It was designed to make Sarah's proactive decision appear as an admission of failure. She tried to explain that having a service dog represented commitment to her children's, that it was an additional tool in her arsenal of coping mechanisms, that it demonstrated responsibility and foresight. But her explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. Victoria smiled, satisfied, and returned to her seat. Courtroom felt stifling. Sarah was hyperventilating now, though she was trying desperately to hide it. Her chest felt tight, her vision slightly blurred. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the room too cold, the judgmental eyes too many. She could feel a panic attack building on the horizon, that familiar sensation of her mind fragmenting, her body betraying her, everything spiraling out of control. Not here. Not now. Not in front of the judge who was clearly already convinced she was unstable. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. Her breathing became shallow, rapid, panicked. She could hear the slight murmuring in the courtroom, people noticing, people judging, people confirming narrative. This was it. This was the final nail in the coffin. Her hands shook so badly she worried they might slip off the table. Tears blurred her vision again. She was losing it completely and utterly, losing her grip on composure. Then Bella moved. The dog, who had been lying calmly at Sarah's feet throughout the entire testimony, suddenly rose. She didn't bark or make any noise. That wasn't her training. Instead, she positioned herself directly beside Sarah's chair and leaned her full weight against Sarah's left leg with deliberate, intentional pressure. The deep pressure therapy response was exactly what she'd been trained to do in situations like this. The 45-pound dog pressed firmly against Sarah's thigh and calf, providing the kind of grounding sensory input that could interrupt a panic attack. Sarah's hand moved almost automatically. She reached down and gave Bella the smallest signal, barely perceptible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Just a subtle squeeze of the dog's collar, a nearly invisible gesture of acknowledgement and communication. It was the hand signal they'd practiced hundreds of times during Bella's training. It was a moment of such intimacy and specific intention that it revealed something profound about their relationship. And Judge Harrison saw it. What the judge witnessed in that microsecond was something far more significant than a woman petting her dog. he observed something that would fundamentally alter his perspective on Sarah Mitchell. He saw a woman who, even in the midst of an anxiety attack, even while her carefully constructed composure was crumbling, maintained enough self-awareness and control to communicate with her support system. He saw training, intention, precision, and purpose. He saw someone who had not only sought professional help, but had invested significant time and money in developing specific, practiced coping mechanisms. More importantly, he saw someone who was managing her condition, not denying it. He saw a woman who had built infrastructure to support her mental health, not someone who was broken and failing. The signal revealed that Sarah had done her homework. She'd worked with professionals, she'd learned her triggers, she'd developed tools. This was not the behavior of an unstable, unreliable person. This was the behavior of someone taking responsibility. As Bella maintained the deep pressure against Sarah's leg, something shifted. Sarah's breathing slowed. Her grip on the table loosened. The frantic energy that had been building dissipated. She took a deep breath, deliberate, controlled, practiced. The panic attack that had been on the horizon suddenly retreated. Within 30 seconds, she was composed again, though tears still streaked her cheeks. Judge Harrison's pen stopped moving across his notepad. His eyes remained fixed on Sarah and Bella, and his expression had changed subtly but unmistakably. Where there had been skepticism moments before, now there was something else, thoughtfulness, a reassessment of what he was witnessing. Sarah sat quietly, her hand resting on Bella's head, and the courtroom seemed to pause. Even attorneys had noticed something, though they seemed uncertain exactly what. Victoria's expression had shifted from satisfied to slightly confused, as if she'd expected Sarah to continue spiraling but instead witnessed something unexpected. Himself shifted in his seat, his carefully maintained expression cracking for just an instant, revealing something like concern or possibly alarm. The judge looked at Victoria. "Do you have any further questions for the witness?" Victoria hesitated, and in that hesitation, something important happened. She recognized that the narrative she'd been building had just encountered an obstacle she hadn't anticipated. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice slightly less confident than before. Judge Harrison nodded and looked at Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, you're excused." As Sarah stood to return to the defendant's table, she did so with something that hadn't been present during her testimony: actual composure. Not the fragile, desperate composure she'd tried to maintain before, but real, earned stability. And everyone in the courtroom saw it. They saw a woman who had been struggling, who had briefly lost her footing, but who had the tools and the awareness to catch herself. They saw evidence of real management, not deterioration. The judge's demeanor had changed noticeably. When he looked at next, there was a new skepticism there, a subtle questioning. He just witnessed something that complicated the narrative he'd been presented with. He'd seen Sarah's vulnerability, yes, but he'd also seen her responsibility. He'd observed her struggle, but he'd also observed her solution. And he'd recognized something that Victoria had failed to anticipate: that asking for help and actively managing a mental health condition wasn't evidence of unfitness. It was evidence of the opposite. Robert whispered something to Sarah as she sat down. That was good, that moment, the judge noticed. Sarah didn't respond, but she placed her hand on Bella's head and felt the dog's warmth, her loyalty, her unwavering presence. She'd needed this. She'd needed to show, not just tell, that she was managing her condition responsibly. And somehow, in giving Bella that subtle signal, in allowing her trained companion to do exactly what she'd been trained to do, Sarah had inadvertently revealed the truth that narrative couldn't accommodate. That strength wasn't the absence of struggle. It was the commitment to managing struggle responsibly. The judge had seen it, and everything was about to change. Judge Harrison sat perfectly still for nearly 3 minutes after Sarah returned to her seat. He didn't move, didn't adjust his glasses, didn't pick up his pen. He simply sat, staring at nothing in particular, processing what he'd just witnessed. In his 28 years on the bench, he developed an almost preternatural ability to read people, to detect the subtle tells that separated truth from manipulation, genuine struggle from performance. And what he just observed had fundamentally altered his assessment of this case. The courtroom remained quiet, waiting for the next procedural step. Attorneys shuffled papers. The court reporter sat at her stenotype machine, but the judge remained in his state of contemplative stillness, his mind clearly working through something significant. Finally, he looked up and made a notation in his file, his handwriting sharp and deliberate. What had struck Judge Harrison most forcefully was the precise nature of Sarah's moment with Bella. In his decades on the bench, he'd seen countless manipulative displays, people crying on cue, carefully constructed emotional performances designed to sway judicial opinion. He'd observed actors playing the role of sympathetic defendant, victims performing victimhood, and perpetrators simulating remorse. He could spot a performance from 50 paces. But what he'd witnessed with Sarah Mitchell had not been performance. It had been something far more authentic and revealing, the implementation of professional training under genuine stress. The signal Sarah had given Bella was so subtle that most people in the courtroom wouldn't have even registered it consciously, but Judge Harrison had seen it. He'd recognized it for what it was, a deliberate communication between a woman and her trained companion, executed with the kind of precision that only comes from months of practiced repetition. This wasn't someone grasping desperately at her dog. This was someone employing a tool she'd invested thousands of dollars and countless hours to develop. This was intentionality. This was responsibility. The judge made additional notes in his file, his pen moving with renewed purpose. He wrote, "Witness demonstrated sophisticated self-awareness and evidence of professional coping mechanisms during apparent anxiety episode. Response suggests significant investment in management strategies, not failure of current treatment. Observation contradicts opposing counsel's narrative of instability and lack of control." He sat back in his chair, considering the implications. Mitchell's testimony had painted Sarah as a woman overwhelmed by her condition, a woman whose mental illness had become increasingly unmanageable, a woman who required constant support and monitoring. But that narrative had just been complicated by a single, honest moment. Sarah hadn't tried to hide her anxiety during questioning. She hadn't pretended to be perfectly stable. She'd simply demonstrated that when her anxiety arose, she had concrete, practiced strategies to manage it. She'd shown the judge exactly what responsible mental health management looked like. Judge Harrison's skepticism towards narrative began to crystallize into something more substantial. He found himself replaying testimony in his mind, noticing details that now seemed more questionable. Had spoken about Sarah's episodes with the specificity of someone recounting objective facts, but upon reflection, many of those facts had been vague on crucial details. He'd mentioned the school play incident, but when pressed during cross-examination, the timeline had shifted. He described Sarah being unable to get out of bed for days, but he hadn't provided specific dates, and his descriptions had remained frustratingly general. In contrast, Sarah had been remarkably specific about her treatment journey. She'd mentioned the names of her medications, her therapy frequency, the cost of Bella's training, her work situation, her involvement in her children's lives. She'd been vulnerable in a way that suggested honesty rather than performance. Yes, she'd become emotional during cross-examination, but the judge now recognized that as evidence of authenticity, not instability. People who were genuinely invested in outcomes often became emotional when those outcomes were at stake. People performing a role maintained their composure. Judge Harrison found himself recalling a case from 15 years ago, a custody dispute where he'd almost made a terrible mistake. He'd nearly awarded custody to a father who'd presented an impeccable, emotionally controlled case. It wasn't until much later, after additional evidence emerged, that the judge had discovered the father had been engaged in systematic parental alienation and had coached his children extensively on what to say. The man's composure hadn't been evidence of stability. It had been evidence of calculated manipulation. The judge had learned from that case to be wary of performances that seemed too perfect, too controlled. His performance had been perfect. It had been exactly calibrated to generate sympathy and concern. It had been the performance of someone who'd prepared extensively, who'd anticipated questions, who'd crafted his responses to maximum emotional effect. And the judge had recognized that preparation as professional. Attorneys had clearly coached him thoroughly. But Sarah's testimony, despite its emotional roughness, had possessed something, had lacked the authenticity of someone fighting for her truth against an adversary with significant advantages. She'd stumbled over her words occasionally. She'd become emotional. She'd revealed her vulnerability. These were the hallmarks of someone being genuinely authentic under pressure, not someone delivering a carefully prepared narrative. The judge's reassessment extended beyond Sarah herself to encompass the entire case framework. He'd been presented with a narrative of a man struggling valiantly to manage an unstable wife's condition for the sake of their children. But what if that narrative had been deliberately constructed to obscure a different truth? What if extensive coaching and legal preparation were designed not to establish his fitness as a parent, but to manipulate the court's perception? Judge Harrison made another notation. Opposing counsel's preparation appears extensive and sophisticated. Consider investigating whether defendant has been influenced by legal strategy rather than presenting authentic account. Request detailed documentation of all treatment records, therapy notes, and medical compliance. This was significant. The judge was essentially flagging in his own notes that his narrative appeared strategically constructed rather than organically honest. He was recognizing the fingerprints of professional manipulation on his testimony, and he was signaling to himself that he needed additional evidence before proceeding, evidence that would either confirm or refute his growing suspicions. What struck Judge Harrison most profoundly was what Sarah's moment with Bella revealed about her actual commitment to her children's. She hadn't just been told by her lawyer to get a service dog to appear sympathetic to the court. Service animals were expensive, required months of training, and represented a genuine lifestyle integration. The fact that Sarah had invested so significantly in Bella suggested not someone performing concern for a judge's benefit, but someone genuinely committed to managing her mental health for her family's sake. You don't spend $15,000 on something you don't authentically believe in. You don't integrate a service animal into your daily life as a performance piece for a single courtroom appearance. The judge's perspective had shifted from skeptical neutrality towards Sarah to active skepticism about his narrative. He'd recognized the difference between genuine vulnerability, presented honestly, and strategic vulnerability designed to manipulate. He'd witnessed Sarah's authentic struggle and her authentic coping mechanisms, and he'd recognized something attorneys clearly hadn't accounted for: that judges with decades of experience could distinguish between real strength and performed strength. Judge Harrison looked at the clock. It was nearly 4 p.m. and he'd scheduled this trial for 2 days. There would be character witnesses, additional testimony, potentially depositions to review. But the judge had already decided that before proceeding further, he needed to examine the documentary evidence. The medical records, therapy notes, medication compliance records, school attendance records, everything that would objectively confirm or refute the competing narratives. He looked at both attorneys. "We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., he announced. "Before we continue with additional testimony, I'm ordering that both parties produce complete documentation of the defendant's medical treatment, therapy records, medication compliance records, and school attendance records for the children over the past 3 years. I want to see objective evidence, not testimony. We'll proceed with witness examination once I've had time to review these materials." Victoria's expression flickered, just for an instant, revealing surprise. She'd clearly expected the judge to continue with the schedule. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah could see tension in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Robert squeezed Sarah's arm. "That's good," he whispered. "Very good. He wants to see the actual evidence." And as court adjourned for the day, Sarah understood that something fundamental had shifted. The judge had seen her. Not the caricaturist narrative had created, but her actual self, struggling, yes, but capable, responsible, genuinely committed to her and her children's welfare. The moment with Bella had cracked open the carefully constructed performance that had been threatening to destroy her, and in that crack, the light of truth had begun to shine through. That evening, Sarah returned to her mother's house to collect her children. Emma and rushed to embrace her, their small bodies a reminder of what this entire ordeal was truly about. She held them both, breathed in the scent of their hair, and tried to present a calm exterior despite the emotional tempest raging inside her. Her mother watched from the kitchen doorway, reading the exhaustion and stress etched into her daughter's face. "How did it go?" asked quietly, once the children had been settled with a movie and snacks. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, sinking into a kitchen chair. "I fell apart during cross-examination. I had an anxiety attack right there in the courtroom. And then Bella," she trailed off, uncertain how to explain the moment that had somehow shifted everything. "Bella what?" her mother prompted. "She did her job, the deep pressure therapy, and I gave her the signal. It was just a moment, Mom, but I think the judge saw it differently than I expected. He ordered them to produce all of my medical records tomorrow, all my therapy notes, my medication compliance, everything." Sat across from her daughter, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "That's good, honey. Your records tell the truth. They'll show the judge exactly how hard you've been working." Sarah nodded, hopping her mother was right. She spent the evening with Emma and tucking them into bed, reading them stories and trying to forget that tomorrow would bring another round of courtroom battles. But sleep eluded her. She lay awake, her mind cycling through possibilities, through fears, through desperate hope. By 9 a.m. the next morning, everyone was back in the courtroom. This time, the atmosphere felt different. Judge Harrison seemed more engaged, more purposeful. He'd spent the evening reviewing the documentation that had been submitted overnight, and his expression suggested he discovered something significant. "Before we continue with testimony," the judge announced, "I'd like to address the documentary evidence that was provided this morning. I've reviewed the defendant's medical records, therapy notes, and treatment history for the past 3 years. I have some questions." He turned to Sarah's attorney. "Mr. The defendant claims perfect medication compliance over the past 3 years. Is that accurate?" Robert nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. According to her pharmacy records and her physician's documentation, Ms. Mitchell has refilled her prescriptions consistently every 30 days, without exception for 36 consecutive months." The judge made a note. He turned to his legal team. "Does the respondent dispute this?" Victoria hesitated, clearly uncertain how to proceed. "Your Honor, we're not disputing the pharmacy records. However, taking medication isn't necessarily an indication that the defendant's condition has improved. She could be taking her medication while still experiencing significant episodes." "Thank you," Judge Harrison interrupted. "I have additional questions about the therapy records. According to these notes, the defendant has maintained weekly therapy sessions for 3 years without cancellation. Furthermore, the therapist has documented progressively improving mental health markers, increased coping mechanism development, and what she describes as exceptional commitment to treatment. Can you explain what that means in practical terms, Mr.?" Sarah's attorney stood. "Your Honor, exceptional commitment to treatment means the defendant has followed every recommendation, completed every assignment, been honest about her struggles, and actively worked to improve rather than simply accepting her diagnosis as static. It indicates someone who's taking responsibility for her mental health rather than viewing it as something happening to her." Judge Harrison nodded, making extensive notes. Then he asked for Bella's certification documents. Sarah's attorney presented them. Comprehensive documentation from the Certified Service Animal Training Facility, including specific notation of Bella's training for deep pressure therapy, anxiety response interruption, and emotional regulation support. The certification detailed the 18-month professional training process, the behavioral testing, the specific protocols Bella had been trained to execute. "This is substantial documentation," the judge observed, studying the paperwork carefully. "The cost of this training was approximately $15,000, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Robert confirmed. Judge Harrison looked over his glasses at Mr. Mitchell. "When you yesterday about your ex-wife's financial situation, did you mention this expense?" Shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't aware of the exact amount she'd spent on the dog." "You weren't aware," the judge repeated, his tone suggesting skepticism. "Yet you characterized her as financially irresponsible in your testimony. You suggested that her mental health condition had prevented her from maintaining stable employment and income. But according to these tax returns for the past 3 years, the defendant has maintained a consistent freelance accounting practice with steady income. In fact, her annual earnings have increased year over year. Do you dispute that?" "No, Your Honor, but she—" "I didn't ask a yes or no question yet," the judge said firmly. "My question is, did you intentionally omit the defendant's financial stability and her significant investment in her own mental health management from your testimony, or were you simply unaware of these facts?" His face reddened. I may have focused on the more difficult periods." "You may have," the judge repeated, his tone suggesting he'd made a judgment about its credibility. He turned back to the medical records. According to her therapist's notes, there were 2 documented anxiety episodes in the presence of the children over the past 3 years, both occurring more than 2 years ago, and both occurring prior to the optimization of her medication regimen. Is that accurate? "Yes, Your Honor," Robert confirmed. So when the respondent yesterday about multiple frightening episodes, he was describing events from more than 2 years ago, before the defendant's current treatment protocol was in place. "That appears to be the case, Your Honor." Judge Harrison's expression hardened. He turned to his legal team. "I find it curious that the respondent characterized his ex-wife's mental health challenges as increasingly difficult to manage, when the documentary evidence suggests they've become increasingly well managed. The episodes he described in detail occurred before the defendant's current successful treatment protocol was established. Would you care to address this discrepancy?" Victoria stood, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "Your Honor, the respondent was describing his experiences and concerns as he perceived them, his characterization of the situation." "His characterization was contradicted by documentary evidence," the judge interrupted. "That's my point. He about ongoing instability. The records show increasing stability. Those are materially different narratives." The judge then turned his attention to the school records, which showed Emma and its attendance, academic performance, and behavioral notes. Both children had perfect attendance records. Both were performing at grade level academically. Teachers' comments consistently mentioned the children as well-adjusted, engaged, and emotionally stable. One teacher had specifically noted Emma's particularly close relationship with her mother, who attends all school events and maintains consistent communication about Emma's. "These are remarkable school records," the judge observed. "They suggest children with a stable home environment and an engaged parent. They do not suggest children who are frightened, confused, or emotionally traumatized by their mother's mental health condition." Attorney made an attempt to mitigate the damage. "Your Honor, these positive records don't mean the defendant hasn't experienced episodes. Children can appear fine in school even if they're struggling at home." "That's true," Judge Harrison acknowledged. "However, the children's therapist, whom the respondent himself arranged for them to see, has documented no trauma, no anxiety disorders, no indication that they've been negatively affected by their mother's anxiety condition. In fact, The therapist notes that both children speak affectionately about their mother and express desire to spend more time with her. The therapist specifically noted that neither child demonstrated signs of parental alienation or coach testimony. That's significant. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but his tone increasingly unfavorable toward. What I'm observing here is a pattern. The respondent presented testimony describing an ex-wife whose mental health condition is uncontrolled and frightening. But the documentary evidence presents a very different picture. A woman who's taken aggressive action to manage her condition, who maintains perfect compliance with treatment, who's maintained stable employment and income, who's invested $15,000 in her own mental health, and whose children are thriving academically and emotionally. He looked directly at. The respondent had the opportunity to present a truthful, balanced account of his ex-wife's situation. Instead, he appears to have selected specific historical incidents from more than 2 years ago, before her current treatment protocol was established, and presented them as ongoing current struggles. The respondent failed to mention her perfect treatment compliance, her consistent therapy engagement, her employment stability, or her children's emotional. Can you explain why you omitted such material information? Opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His attorneys were frantically whispering to him, clearly advising him that any answer would be problematic. I was concerned about her condition, finally said weakly. I was trying to protect our children. By misrepresenting the current state of her mental health in court, Judge Harrison asked coldly. By emphasizing historical episodes while omitting evidence of her successful recovery. That's not protection, Mr. Mitchell. That's selective presentation designed to influence this court's judgment. The judge turned to face the courtroom. Based on the documentary evidence I've reviewed, I'm finding the respondent's testimony to be materially inaccurate regarding the defendant's current mental health status and stability. The evidence suggests not an increasingly unstable woman, but a woman whose condition has significantly improved through responsible treatment engagement. Furthermore, the evidence suggests the respondent deliberately omitted material information that would have complicated his narrative. Sarah felt Robert's hand on her arm, squeezing it gently. She could hardly breathe. The judge had just essentially declared his entire testimony unreliable. He'd identified the narrative as deliberately constructed distortion. And most importantly, he'd found evidence supporting Sarah's honesty and responsibility. Judge Harrison looked at the clock. We'll take a brief recess. When we reconvene, I want to hear from character witnesses. I want to understand who these people actually are beyond the narratives their attorneys have constructed. As the courtroom cleared for recess, Sarah sat frozen, hardly believing what had just happened. Attorneys gathered around him, their confident expressions replaced by obvious concern. Himself looked shaken, his perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of the judge's skeptical scrutiny. For the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, Sarah allowed herself to believe that truth might actually prevail. After the recess, the courtroom reconvened with a fundamentally altered atmosphere. The power dynamics had shifted visibly. Attorneys seemed deflated, their earlier confidence replaced by defensive caution. Judge Harrison appeared renewed, energized by the objective evidence that had contradicted so much of his testimony. And Sarah sat in her chair, Bella's reassuring presence at her feet grounding her in the reality that the truth was finally being heard. The judge addressed directly. Mr. Mitchell, I have some follow-up questions regarding your testimony yesterday. You stated that your ex-wife had an anxiety attack so severe that she missed your daughter's school play. You characterized this as a devastating event that damaged Emma's confidence in performing. Is that accurate? Nodded carefully. Yes, Your Honor, it was difficult for Emma. When exactly did this occur? The judge asked, pen poised over his notepad. It was 3 years ago, right after Sarah's diagnosis, responded. 3 years ago. the judge repeated. So that would have been in November 2021, approximately 6 months after she began her current treatment protocol. Yes, I believe so, said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. And according to the school records I reviewed this morning, Emma has attended every school performance opportunity since that time. She participated in the choir last year, performed in a school play this past spring, and participated in a talent show 2 months ago. Her teacher notes indicate she's developed into a confident performer. Does that align with your description of lasting damage to her confidence? Shifted uncomfortably. She may have recovered since then. She may have, the judge repeated, making a note. So your characterization of an ongoing deficit in your daughter's confidence, something you presented as evidence of current parental unfitness, was actually describing an isolated incident from 3 years ago that your daughter has apparently overcome. Is that accurate? I suppose so, said quietly. You suppose so, the judge said coolly. Let me ask you about another incident. That there was a morning when your ex-wife couldn't get out of bed and your daughter came to you crying. When did that occur? Hesitated. It was several years ago, maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. So that would also be before her current medication protocol was established, before the deep pressure therapy dog, before her most recent therapeutic breakthroughs. Yes, admitted. Yet you presented these historical incidents that occurred before her current successful treatment, as evidence that she's currently unable to parent. You essentially used evidence of her former struggles before she got the help that worked, as proof that she remains unstable. Do you see the logical problem with that reasoning? His face had turned a mottled red. He didn't respond, and the judge continued mercilessly. You also that you've had to be both mother and father, because your ex-wife's condition made her unable to parent. Yet according to the custody arrangement prior to this hearing, the defendant had primary custody 40% of the time. The children spent 60% of their time with you. So when you say you've had to be both mother and father, you mean you had to manage the children 40% of the time that they were with their mother, plus the 60% of the time they were with you. Correct? Yes, but when she had episodes. How many episodes would you say occurred during her 40% custody time, on average, per month, over the past 2 years? The judge interrupted. Opened his mouth, closed it. I don't keep specific records. No, you don't. But your ex-wife's therapist does. And according to those records, in the past 2 years, there have been 0 documented anxiety episodes occurring during her scheduled custody time. 0. In fact, the therapist notes that the defendant specifically schedules her most challenging therapeutic work for times when the children are with you, because she's committed to maintaining stability during her parenting time. That's a radically different picture from the one you presented, isn't it? Said nothing. I'm going to make a finding, the judge continued, his tone now openly adversarial. I find that you've presented a materially misleading account of your ex-wife's current mental health status by emphasizing historical episodes from more than 2 years ago while omitting evidence of her significant improvement. I find that you've misrepresented her parenting capability by describing her as unable to function, when the objective evidence shows perfect custody compliance and children who are thriving. And I find that you've shaped your narrative with the apparent assistance of counsel to maximize emotional impact while minimizing factual accuracy. His attorney started to stand to object, but the judge held up a hand. I'm not finished. You also that your ex-wife's mental health condition has caused you significant financial hardship. Yet according to the financial records submitted, you earn approximately $130,000 annually. You own your residence free and clear, and you maintain investment accounts totaling approximately $200,000. Meanwhile, the defendant earns approximately $60,000 annually, rents her residence, and maintains minimal savings. You've actually been in a far more stable financial position than your ex-wife throughout this entire process. Your characterization of financial burden rings hollow. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Sarah could see physically shrinking in his chair, his earlier confidence completely demolished. Then the judge said, "I'm going to hear from character witnesses now. Mr. Call your first witness." Robert stood. "Your Honor, the defense calls doctor, therapist for the defendant." Doctor took the stand, a professional woman in her 50s with the calm demeanor of someone who'd worked in mental health for decades. She was sworn in, and Robert began his questioning. "Doctor, can you describe your professional relationship with Ms. Mitchell?" "I've been providing therapy to Ms. Mitchell for the past 3 years, on a weekly basis without interruption," Doctor explained. "She presents with anxiety disorder and PTSD stemming from childhood trauma. She's been an exceptional client." "Can you elaborate on that?" Robert asked. "Certainly. Ms. Mitchell comes to every session prepared, engaged, and honest. She completes assigned therapeutic work between sessions. She's implemented the coping strategies we've developed. She's maintained perfect medication compliance, which she discusses with me regularly. Most importantly, she's demonstrated remarkable insight into her condition and genuine commitment to recovery. In my professional experience, the majority of people with anxiety disorders show inconsistent engagement with treatment. Ms. Mitchell is exceptional in her consistency and her willingness to do the difficult work required for healing." Victoria stood for cross-examination. "Doctor, has Ms. Mitchell ever missed a therapy session?" "Never," Doctor responded, "not once in 3 years." "Has she ever called you in crisis? Has she ever needed emergency intervention?" "No," the therapist said. "Her anxiety is well managed with her current treatment protocol. She uses her coping mechanisms proactively rather than waiting until she's in crisis." "But she still experiences anxiety, correct? She's not cured." "That's an important distinction," Doctor said carefully. "Ms. Mitchell has an anxiety disorder. That's not something that gets cured. It's something that gets managed. The goal of treatment isn't to eliminate her capacity for anxiety. Anxiety is a normal human emotion. The goal is to help her manage it effectively so it doesn't interfere with her functioning. By that measure, Ms. Mitchell has achieved excellent outcomes." "Would you describe her as fit to parent?" Victoria asked. "Absolutely," Doctor said without hesitation. "More than that, I would describe her as an exceptionally dedicated parent. She's made decisions about her mental health specifically to benefit her children. That level of intentionality and love speaks volumes about her fitness as a parent." Next, the judge asked to hear from Emma and's teacher, Mr. He that both children were thriving academically and socially, that Emma was confident and engaged, that was happy and well-adjusted, and that Sarah attended virtually every school event and communicated consistently about her children's progress. Then Sarah's mother took the stand. She about her daughter's struggle, her commitment to recovery, and her devotion to her. She described witnessing Sarah's transformation over 3 years from someone who'd been barely functional to someone who was managing her condition responsibly and actively parenting her children. With each testimony's narrative crumbled further. The character witnesses didn't refute what he'd said. They simply provided context and evidence that contradicted the implications he'd created. Yes, Sarah had struggled. No, those struggles had not been ongoing or currently disabling. Yes, she'd needed help. Yes, she'd sought that help and implemented it successfully. Yes, her children loved her and were thriving with her. By the time the character witness testimony concluded, sat slumped in his chair, his face a mask of defeat. His attorneys exchanged grim looks, clearly recognizing that their case had collapsed entirely. What had begun as a seemingly compelling narrative about a struggling woman who needed her ex-husband's protection had transformed, through the patient revelation of objective evidence and professional testimony, into something very different. A story about a man who'd weaponized his ex-wife's honest struggles against her, using her vulnerability as ammunition while conveniently omitting evidence of her remarkable recovery. Judge Harrison looked at both attorneys. "I think I have sufficient information to make a determination. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for closing arguments and my ruling." As the courtroom cleared, wouldn't look at Sarah. His attorneys gathered around him, clearly explaining the grave danger he now faced. But Sarah simply sat quietly, Bella's head resting on her lap, and allowed herself to breathe. The truth had been spoken. The evidence had been presented. And somehow, incredibly, the judge had listened. Sarah slept fitfully that night, her mind unable to fully rest despite her physical exhaustion. She lay in bed beside Bella, her hand resting on the dog's warm fur, drawing comfort from the steady rhythm of the animal's breathing. Tomorrow would bring the judge's ruling. Tomorrow would determine whether she got to keep her children or whether manipulations had been successful enough to sway the court despite the evidence. She tried to prepare herself for both possibilities, but her heart kept insisting on hope, a dangerous, fragile hope that the truth might actually matter. At 8:45 a.m., Sarah walked into the courtroom for what she prayed would be the final time. She was dressed again in her navy blazer, the same armor she'd worn for the previous 2 days. Bella walked beside her, the dog's presence a tangible reminder that Sarah had built infrastructure to support herself, that she had tools, that she had made intentional choices to become well. Was already seated, flanked by his attorneys, who whispered urgently to him even as the judge entered and everyone rose. Judge Harrison took his seat and arranged his papers with deliberate care. He looked out over the courtroom, his gaze sweeping across both parties. Then he began to speak, and his words carried the weight of 2 days of careful consideration, of evidence reviewed, of narratives deconstructed. "This is a custody matter involving 2 parents, 2 children, and significantly different versions of the defendant's mental health condition and parenting capability," Judge Harrison began, his voice steady and measured. "I've heard testimony from both parties. I've reviewed extensive documentary evidence. I've heard from professional mental health providers and from educators, and I need to make clear findings regarding what I believe to be true in this case." He paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle over the courtroom. "First, I find that the respondent's testimony was materially misleading regarding the defendant's current mental health status. The respondent presented historical episodes from more than 2 years ago, episodes that occurred before the defendant's current successful treatment protocol was established, as evidence of ongoing instability. He omitted any mention of the defendant's perfect medication compliance, her consistent therapy engagement, or her documented mental health improvement. This selective presentation constituted a misrepresentation to the court. His face hardened, but the judge continued, allowing no interruption. "Second, I find that the defendant has demonstrated exceptional commitment to her mental health management. She has maintained perfect treatment compliance for 3 years. She has invested significant financial and personal resources in her recovery, including the substantial investment in professional service animal training. She has implemented recommended coping strategies and has worked consistently to improve her mental health not for the sake of this court proceeding, but for the sake of her children's." The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression becoming even more serious. "Third, I find that the defendant's mental health condition has not prevented her from being an excellent parent. Both children are thriving academically and emotionally. Both children maintain close relationships with their mother. School records indicate perfect attendance and behavioral engagement. The children's own therapist, arranged by the respondent himself, has documented no trauma, no anxiety, no indication of parental alienation. The children love their mother, and she clearly loves them." Sarah felt tears beginning to form, but she forced herself to remain composed, to listen to every word the judge was saying. "Fourth, I find that the respondent has benefited materially from the current custody arrangement and has motivation to maintain it. His financial position is significantly more stable than the defendant's. He has sought to characterize himself as a heroic protector while characterizing the defendant as a burdensome problem requiring his management. However, The objective evidence does not support this narrative. The defendant has managed her own condition, maintained her own income, and effectively parented her children, while the respondent has benefited from a custody arrangement that gives him the majority of parenting time and the associated financial benefits. The judge leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more emphatic. Fifth, I want to address a moment that occurred during the defendant's testimony. The defendant was experiencing anxiety during cross-examination, a completely understandable response to aggressive questioning about her most vulnerable aspects. However, rather than spiraling or losing control, the defendant demonstrated sophisticated self-awareness. She implemented a trained coping mechanism, a service dog trained specifically for deep pressure therapy. The signal she gave her dog was subtle but deliberate, indicating months of professional training and practiced execution. This moment revealed something crucial about the defendant's character. She doesn't hide from her anxiety or pretend it doesn't exist. Instead, she faces it directly and implements concrete strategies to manage it. That is not evidence of unfitness. That is evidence of exceptional responsibility. The judge's voice grew warmer, more approving. I've observed in my years on the bench that true strength is not the absence of struggle. True strength is the commitment to managing struggle responsibly. True strength is asking for help and following through on that help. True strength is investing in one's own recovery, not for external validation, but for the sake of the people you love. The defendant has demonstrated all of these forms of strength. He paused, letting his words settle. Based on all of the evidence presented, I am making the following ruling. Primary custody of Emma Mitchell and Mitchell is awarded to the defendant, Sarah Mitchell. The respondent shall have visitation every other weekend and one evening per week. The respondent shall contribute to costs in accordance with state guidelines. Furthermore, I'm recommending that the respondent consider his own therapeutic work regarding this matter, as his attempt to weaponize his ex-wife's mental health condition against her in a custody proceeding raises concerns about his own judgment. Sarah heard the words, but they didn't quite register immediately. She stared at the judge, her mind struggling to process the reality of what she just heard. Additionally, the judge continued, I want to place on record my commendation for the defendant's approach to her mental health. In a world that often stigmatizes mental illness, the defendant has demonstrated how to engage with mental illness responsibly and courageously. She sought professional help. She's maintained consistent treatment. She's invested in tools and strategies. She's been honest about her struggles rather than hiding them. And she's done all of this not for this courtroom, but for her children. That is admirable, and it speaks directly to her fitness as a parent. The judge looked directly at Sarah. Ms. Mitchell, you've shown remarkable courage throughout this process. You should know that this court recognizes not despite your mental health condition, but in part because of how you've managed it, that you are an exemplary parent. Your children are fortunate to have a mother who's committed so thoroughly to her own. Your example teaches them that struggling with mental health is not shameful, but that addressing it responsibly is noble. Sarah's tears finally spilled over, but these were different tears than the ones she'd shed in that courtroom 2 days ago. These were tears of validation, of vindication, of finally being seen and understood. The judge struck his gavel. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in quiet activity. Robert was shaking her hand, congratulating her. Her mother, who'd been sitting in the gallery, was rushing toward her with open arms. But Sarah remained seated for a moment, Bella's head under her hand, processing the reality that she'd won. Not because she'd hidden her mental illness, not because she'd pretended to be perfectly stable, but because she'd faced her struggles directly and managed them responsibly. And his attorneys gathered their papers, and Sarah watched as her ex-husband left the courtroom without looking back. She felt no triumph, no desire to gloat. She felt only relief and gratitude that the truth had prevailed. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood on the steps in the afternoon sunlight with her mother and Bella. News of the ruling had somehow already spread. A reporter approached her microphone in hand, asking if she'd like to comment. Sarah hesitated for only a moment, then she spoke clearly and directly. "I want to say that mental illness is not a character flaw," she said into the camera. "Struggling with anxiety or PTSD doesn't make someone a bad parent, but seeking help, maintaining treatment, and implementing coping strategies, that makes someone responsible. That makes someone committed to being better. I'm grateful to the court for recognizing that managing mental health is strength, not weakness. And I'm grateful to everyone who supported me through this journey." As she finished speaking, she felt her mother's arm around her shoulders and Bella's solid presence at her side. These two had been her anchors through everything: her family, her support system, her evidence that she was not alone. Later that evening, Sarah collected Emma and from their grandmother's house. She told them in age-appropriate language that she would be their primary home, that they would stay with Mommy most of the time. Emma's face showed relief and joy, jumped up and down, asking if that meant more time for bedtime stories with Mommy. "Yes, baby," Sarah said, pulling him into her arms. "So many more bedtime stories." That night, as Sarah tucked her children into bed, she felt something shift inside her. The shame that had haunted her, shame about her anxiety disorder, shame about needing medication and therapy, shame about requiring a service dog, it began to dissolve. The judge's words echoed in her mind. True strength is the commitment to managing struggle responsibly. She looked at her children's peaceful faces and understood that she'd given them something more valuable than the absence of mental illness. She'd given them an example of how to face life's challenges with honesty, courage, and commitment to getting better. She'd shown them that weakness acknowledged and addressed transforms into strength. As Sarah descended the stairs and settled on the couch with Bella's head in her lap, she allowed herself to fully absorb what had happened. She'd walked into that courtroom terrified that her mental health would be used against her. Instead, the court had recognized that her commitment to managing her mental health was evidence of her fitness as a parent. Her honesty about her struggles had become her greatest strength. Her vulnerability, when paired with responsibility and action, had been vindicated. Tomorrow she would wake up and return to her regular life, the therapy sessions, the medication, the daily work of managing her anxiety. But she would do it with a new understanding, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that managing mental illness responsibly was something to be proud of, that her children didn't need a mother who was perfect. They needed a mother who was honest, committed, and willing to do the work required to be well. And that was exactly what Sarah Mitchell had become. The end.